Good morning, everyone. Hey, welcome back to the second day of GOE. This morning I have the distinct privilege of introducing an Air Force jet pilot, a space pioneer, and a true American hero. After graduating undergraduate pilot training at the top of his class, Lt Kranz was assigned to fly the Air Force's fastest jets, the F-86 and the F-100. He was part of the last F-86s, the 50th wing, to leave Korea. But the Air Force was not his destiny. Fate would lead him along another path. In 1958, he took a position as a test flight at McDonald's Aircraft Company in Holloman Air Force Base in Mexico to test the Quail decoy missile for the B-47 and B-52 bombers. In 1960, while reading Aviation Weekly, he came upon an ad advertising for the newly established NASA Space Task Group at Langley Field in Virginia. He applied and was instantly hired as the assistant to the flight director, Dr. Chris Kraft, for the Project Mercury program. 39 years ago today, Mr. Kranz took the Flight Control Council for the first time as flight director. And yes, it was 39 years ago today that the famous white vest was first donned in mission control. His white flight was on duty during Apollo 11 and was responsible for bringing astronauts Jim Lovell, Fred Hayes, and Jack Swigert back to Earth safely. For their efforts, President Nixon awarded Dr. Kranz and his flight control team the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, a true space pioneer and an American hero, Mr. Gene Kranz.
Morning. You know, Chewy, before we get started today, I was listening through all of yesterday morning and afternoon's talk, and I'd be interested in what interested you in flying? How did you get interested in flying?
Well, I'm glad you asked. It started back in Iowa.
This was a really great intro. I was really privileged to fly in the same skies many years later than many of you folks did, and had the opportunity to fly the last Sabres in the Korean skies. We closed out in 1957 Sabre operations over there and took our aircraft down to Taiwan, and they did a good job. And it's a real pleasure to be here today, and it's really, it's almost overwhelming to be with this group. I have lithographs of aircraft done by Robert Taylor. And basically, I have many of your autographs on those lithographs. I have Ralph Pyers there, and I'm now wearing his lapel pin. And I'm going to close the loop when I get back home because his picture is hanging right up on the wall in my office. Chewy, let's roll.
Well, sir, we're going to start off with the early space task group at Langley. In 1960, you walked onto Langley Field and walked into the space task group, and we'd like to start and tell us a little bit about that.
Space Task Group was a incredible chemistry. There were about 150 to 200 total people involved there, and about a third of them came from Langley Research Center, classic aeronautical engineers from the Mecca of American aeronautical research. Mid-level management, I was surprised when I walked in because they were all English or Canadian. We were fortunate that we pulled in the entire Avro Aero flight test team, and at that time they had 6 aircraft, 6 Aeros, 4 of which were flying, had already exceeded the Mach 1, top performing airplane in the world, and one of the airplane was being prepared for the assault in Mach 2 when the Canadian government canceled the program. So basically, we had the Canadian engineers, and then basically I came in from the American flight test establishment, along with several other aviators. And the chemistry that evolved was really spectacular. You had the very methodical process that the engineers at Langley used in analyzing a problem. You had the incremental flight test process that the English used in developing the aircraft, and basically we were more of the kick the tire, light the fire, and let's get on with it. When you reported in for duty, and I'm sure many of you have seen this, so you had about 2 weeks of reading manuals that were piled about a foot on top of your desk, and you got familiar with all the tech orders and the spacecraft and the rockets. I'd never seen a rocket, never seen a spacecraft in my entire life. And 2 days into this process, a gentleman comes up and he says, look, you're working for operations right now, and I want you to go down to the Cape and write a countdown and write some mission rules. And when you're through, give me a call and we'll come down and launch. So my introduction to the business of spaceflight was to report down to the Cape, and you find your way around there. You walked out to the launch complex, and you got familiar with the Redstone rocket, which looked like just a giant stovepipe that was sitting up there, and the Mercury capsule sitting on top of that guy was like a buoy that you'd sent out in the harbor. You walked over to Hangar XS, and you got to know many of the engineers that were working over there, and it was incredible. The learning curve was so steep that every individual you had would open the door for you and just pour out the information that he personally had. I mean, the mutual learning and the bonding and the teamwork that developed in those early days was incredible. Got into the Mercury, remind me to come back to this point, but yes. Got into the Mercury Control Center. And I was absolutely unfamiliar. We didn't have any computers in those days. The only computers that we had were up at Goddard Space Flight Center. I thought, this is sort of strange. We're going to be launching from the Cape, but all of our computers are up at Goddard. These computers were, believe it or not, serial numbers 1 and serial number 2. The first solid-state machines ever produced by IBM. And on the island of Bermuda, we put what we considered a reliable vacuum tube computer with a small team of 5 controllers. And we always tried to launch eastward over the islands such that if we had communications problems with the crew during powered flight, the team in Bermuda would tell the astronauts what to do when the engine shut down. Anyway, so this was sort of the environment that you walked into. Our communications technology we used in those days was basically a 60-word-per-minute teletype. We had 13 tracking stations around the world, and basically we communicated by teletype to each one of the tracking stations, and our backup communications was Morse code. So we spent as much time practicing Morse code as we did learning about the spacecraft and what basically the mission was about. Anyway, I'd been down at the Cape for roughly about 2 weeks and called up Chris Kraft and said, Chris, I think we're ready to go. I really wasn't sure, but I think we're ready to go. I've written a countdown, talked to the test conductor out the pad and basically the people in Mercury Control, and I think we're ready to go. And he says, well, have you written your mission rules yet? And I said, well, I'm not quite sure what you mean. Well, in today's vernacular, you'd call them the rules of engagement. It's basically, what is the risk plan? What do you need to go? Where do you decide, okay, time to call it a day? It's no-go situation. So I wrote the go, no-go criteria for launch down. Chris came down with a team of about 4 people, and we rehearsed this countdown several times. And it's now time to launch our first Redstone. We get down to firing command. The engine ignites. The rocket lifts 4 inches off the pad. Then the engine shuts down. Through some miracle, this rocket landed back up in the right in the launch stand. And then the escape tower fires. It zips up to about 4,000 feet and then came plummeting down at the viewing stand, and all the senators and congressmen ran for cover. This was just the beginning of the day. This is my first launch, beginning of the day. So then the parachute comes out because the capsule thinks it's in recovery, and darn, we better get these parachutes out. So the parachutes come out, chaff gets scattered all over the place, and then the sea breeze catches us, and you got these big parachutes inflating, ready to topple this Redstone rocket. So then I say, my God, what do? We got a live rocket, we got no control over this guy. And then the ideas start coming in. Gee, why don't we get somebody to reattach the umbilical? Well, that was pyrotechnically severed, no way. Then we're going to get a cherry picker and cut the risers in the chute with pruning shears. That won't do it. You then get to the point where you're down to serious thinking and say, well, let's take a rifle and shoot some holes really in the tank, and we'll depressurize the system. This is when we came up with the first rule in mission control. If you don't know what to do, don't do nothing. And that's exactly what we did. We just hung in there, and ourselves and the launch complex watched over this bird until the batteries depleted. Then all the valves went back to a normal position. The system vented, and now we were able to approach the guy safely. So that was our first launch. Well, we came back down and sort of improved our procedures, made sure we launched the whole thing. And next month we went up and had our first successful Redstone rocket. Interspersed with this was our Atlas, and about that time our track record with the Atlas was probably about 60-40. And we launched 2 of our first 3 Atlases blew up. One self-destructed and the other one was destroyed by range safety. Now in mission control, it was interesting, again, the chemistry that was forming within this group. If you would listen, you had Chris Kraft at the flight director's console. A Welshman, Tech Roberts, was the guy who did all of our trajectory work. He was the guy who said it's, you know, on the proper trajectory, we're going to be up in orbit, etc. You had an Englishman, John Hodge, Londoner, out in Bermuda. So you had this mixture of voices, just the communication. It was just really a melting pot. It really was great. We finally got our act together, and after we had blown up our second Atlas, we were now moving into 61. We still had not been in orbit yet, and launched Alan Shepard. We had our first manned launch. It was a 20-minute up and down mission. And then President Kennedy, in May of 61, says it's time to go to the moon. And we really want to challenge you people working in the business of spaceflight. And you know, his words were almost prophetic. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. And he made this statement before we had ever put an American spacecraft into Earth orbit. But basically, that was all we needed. We were charged, we were ready to go, and we got on with it. The business of mission control evolved around several strong leaders. We had Walt Williams, who was the overall ops boss, and he was pioneer director of the NACA high-speed test station out in the West Coast, and he was also the project manager for the X-1 rocket ship. So we had that kind of a top-level leader. Then we had Chris Kraft, who had come in from the wind tunnels at Langley Research Center, and basically they had been working around with pilotless aircraft programs. John Hodge was an interesting one. He was being trained as a glider pilot over in England at the end of the war, and he was my immediate boss. So it was Chris Kraft, John Hodge, and myself who basically were fortunate to be in position to start forming the early teams that we had in mission control.
Thanks, sir. Early on, we started to develop the team concept after the Mercury program. We went into Gemini, and they had 3 teams there, the red, white, and blue. Talk to us a little bit.
It was, instead of having the Kranz flight control team, the Hodge, and the Kraft team, we decided we'd use colors. So we picked the colors, red, white, and blue. Kraft was red, and when it came time to form the teams, he was being senior in the organization. He took all the top performers. Okay? Hodge came in, he was number 2 in the team, so he got, you know, the next group of people. So basically with the white team, as I, the junior guy in the program here, I got all the people with communications problems and everything else. So it was really a challenge to pull these people together, and I was getting ready for my first launch. And these are kids that are in their very early 20s, and you're getting ready to launch something, you've never done this before. And I went home one evening and talked to my wife, and I said, you know, I got to find some way to give these controllers a sense of identity. And she says, you know, I made the scarves for the pilots in the squadron that you were in, and I understand the significance, the value of the squadron insignia, so why don't I make you a white vest representing your team with the controllers? Well, you never tell your wife that's a silly idea. But she went ahead and made the vest. So now it's put up or shut up time. So I carry that thing into mission control, getting ready for my first launch. And I hang it behind the console, and it's down at launch minus 9 minutes. It's guts check time. You go into a built-in hold, and that's the last opportunity really that you've got for anybody to bring up any problems and say, hey, I want to really think this over. Yeah, I always send everybody out to the restroom because that's the last restroom break. Everybody comes in, and I'm standing at the console with this white vest on. Well, now my co-pilot, assistant flight director, rolls over in the console, and he says, you know, he says, if you don't take that thing off, they're going to haul you out of here, and then I'm going to be in charge. And isn't that scary? So anyway, he then takes and pans all the television sets in the mission control are turned on, and I'm standing on every one of them with this white vest. Well, this turned into really a slick idea because it provided the rallying point for the team, and for each one of the missions, Marta would make a different vest in secret, so I'd wear it for the first time. If we really did a great job, saves in the mission, et cetera, to go home before the end of the mission. The first one of these was in Gemini 9, where we recovered from some pretty tough problems. And I said, Marta, I need a vest to tell my team they done well. So she made a very fancy, this was gold, silver, brocade, et cetera. I wore this on the console for the final shift, and my team knew that debriefing was going to be a snap. And so that was sort of the background on the early flight control teams. I flew every mission in the Gemini program, and it's time to move on to Apollo.
And that's exactly right. Gemini was, how am I doing?
How did you get interested in flying? Okay.
Of course, as we know, the Mercury program and the Gemini program were just stepping stones for Apollo, and our first Apollo flight was really a cornerstone in history, and something that really melded your team and the Apollo team together. We'd like to hear your story on that.
Yeah, we had when it came time to again select the flight directors for the Apollo 1 launch, Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Chris, myself, and again John Hodge were the three that were selected for the first launch of the Apollo program. And we had just come off, myself and John had come off the Gemini 12 mission. And we really felt we had a pretty hot hand, and we were all set to move into Apollo. We started our transition, and it was obvious this program was having difficulties getting off the ground. They're having problems down at the Cape with the test procedures in there. The spacecraft wasn't performing well. The simulators weren't doing well. The crew was unhappy. The controllers were saying, look, it's time to regroup here. And I believe that we looked at the situation and said, look, we've come out of tougher problems in the past. We can pull this together. We can get ready to go. And we just decided we'd press on. And the testing, the day before the Apollo fire, I had been leading the test team in the spacecraft. It's what we call the plugs-in test. It's one where we have all the electrical power hooked up to the spacecraft, so you're running on external power. It was pretty ragged, but we, over a 24-hour period of time, we finished the test sequence, and without a break, cycled into the countdown for what we call the plugs out, which is a final rehearsal of the last 9 minutes of the countdown. This time here we remove external power, go to internal power, which is fuel cells at that time. And I had kicked off the countdown that morning, and the count was going pretty well. We had pretty good operations, communications were up and working. People seemed sharp as a tack in there, and we continued on through the day, and about 3 o'clock in the afternoon I handed over to Chris to continue the count. About the time that we handed over, the crew started complaining about smell of sour eggs in the spacecraft, something what happened to the communications, and we really started staggering for about the next hour. And at 5:31 that evening, we were startled by screams coming from our crew, and we listened to them as they died. And this was probably one of the toughest times I think we've ever had in mission control in our entire life, because we knew that we were responsible for America's first space disaster. And we worked through the weekend trying to figure out what the hell went wrong and what were we going to do about it. And come Monday morning, it was time to talk to my troops. And in my office, I had basically a plaque that was to remind me of the rest of the work. It says, aviation in itself is not inherently dangerous, but it is terribly unforgiving of carelessness, incapacity, or neglect. And I carried that thought over into the meeting room where we had it. Was basically an auditorium, seated about 300 people. And I was trying to find the right words to make my people understand their responsibility for this abject failure. And I started talking about my feelings about flight test, my feelings about the work, and I concluded that says, from now on, the teams in mission control will be known by 2 words. Will be known as tough and competent. Tough meaning we will never get shirk from our responsibilities, because we're forever accountable for what we do or what we fail to do. Competent, we'll never again take anything for granted. We will never stop learning. And we used these words, and we grew And 9 months later, 10 months later really, we launched our first Saturn, and it was perfect. And every mission from that moment forward went perfect. Error-free. Go ahead.
Well, when you started working these procedures, and you changed the aircraft about 1,300 changes in that 10-month period, and you started looking at risk strategy and mission rules.
Mission rules were interesting. That was my first job, and I really loved it because it was trying to establish the boundaries, performance boundaries in the spacecraft, how far we would pursue walking on the edge of these boundaries. And it really addressed how we trade off the risk versus launch versus the risk of accomplishing our objectives during the mission. The risk versus gain strategy. And this turned into a basically top-down strategy written by the flight directors that said, here is how far we intend to pursue this mission. Under these conditions, we will continue to move forward. Under these conditions, we'll back off, see if we can find a better way. And it was the development of this strategy this was done internally with each one of the mission control teams. This then formed the basis so that when we ran into problems we did not anticipate, I knew each one of my controllers' bottom line, they do mine, the crew knew it, we knew where the crew was in every position. We spent almost half of our total mission preparation time developing this overall strategy, and I believe this was the long-term key to our ability to pull many of the missions that were now about to happen out of the fire.
Apollo program keeps continuing on. Apollo 10 goes within 100 miles of landing on the moon, and then in July of 1969, Apollo 11 took off, and on the 20th of July that year, you were on the console, and your team was on the console when those words were uttered, the Eagle has landed.
Yeah, this was really a time when you sit there in mission control, you're about to do something that has never been done before, you're about ready to take a crew to the surface of the moon, and you wonder how you got to this position. And I took a look at the people who basically were my teachers, my leaders. I had a B-17 commander, flew in Italy over Europe, and then B-29s over Japan, who was my first boss in flight test. He really gave me the passion I needed for my work. He had the Chris Kraft, who was the ultimate risk taker. You had John Hodge. So you had these people that somehow or other had given you the background for this day. The lunar landing basically is broken down into two phases from the time you crack the hill, which is about 18-minute period until you start down to the surface. At the time we cracked the hill, things just weren't working right. The first call I get from my guidance officer is, flight, we're halfway to our abort limit. Somewhere along, something had upset our descent trajectory, so we would now start the descent phase from the wrong point. And about that time, the communications went sour on us, and communications were in and out, and we were relaying all the instructions to Mike Collins up in the command module down to the crew in the lunar module. And the overhead of working in this fashion really started burying us. We then had a electrical power problem, AC power problem on board the spacecraft. We told Buzz Aldrin we'd watch it. So we're really staggering, trying to keep all of these pieces orchestrated, and then it's time to make a go, no go for the, let's go for landing. And I get down to landing minus 5 minutes. I didn't have any reason to no-go the launch. I felt my team was solid, had ultimate confidence in my team's ability to pull this thing off. So we give a go, and about the time we give a go, we lose communications again. And this lasts down to almost the time of engine ignition. Well, this was very critical for us because the only measurement we had on propellant quantities was that which came from the totalizer when it was loaded in the launch pad. What we wanted to do is get a measurement in orbit once we started the ullage. We started positioning the fuels to the point where they're in the pickup tubes for the spacecraft. And this was a very important measurement. We missed the damn thing. So now we're working on nominals. We start down, and my guidance controller again comes to me and he says, "Flight, I think we're going to make it." And I knew that he was biasing his call because unknown to us, the crew had not fully depressurized the tunnel between the two spacecraft. So when they separated, it was like champagne cork, pop gun. So it's like doing a very small maneuver that has now placed the spacecraft in the wrong point. And the concern about that That kind of a maneuver will tip the orbit to the point where we could crash into the lunar surface without knowing it, and without the crew knowing it until it's too late. Anyway, it looks like we're going to skate by this thing here. We're now looking for the landing radar data to come in. And the same guy who's got problems with the guidance now starts getting a series of computer program alarms. And this guy is required, and these are, you think about this is back in the 60s, okay? He's trying to look into the guts of the computer, trying to figure out what's going on. We have two types of program alarms. One's what we call a bailout, where the computer says it's too busy to get all of the work done. And if these are sustained over a period of time, then it goes to what we call a poodoo, where the computer says, hey, I need help, and it goes to halt. So we have to avoid this string of bailout alarms. So we start GCAing the crew down to the surface. We tell Buzz Aldrin to stay off the diskey, the keyboard in there, stop giving this computer all this unnecessary work, because Buzz was one of these, I won't say egghead astronauts, but basically he had to know the why of everything. And he was, I mean, on that computer constantly. So we say, Buzz, get off that doggone thing. Well, we managed to make the calls through this process, but now, as a result of this trajectory problem, we're now landing downrange. And we're not landing at the point that we had expected to. We're moving into Boulder Field, we're moving into a whole bunch of craters, and we know it's going to get pretty tight. We normally landed with about 2 minutes fuel reserve at idle throttle setting, which is about 30%. We're now to the point where we hit this, what we call low-level indication. From now on, we have no measurements in the tank except pure time. And it's time as long as the crew is averaging 30% throttle, but the crew is throttling above 30%, down 30%, above 30%, down 30%. The controllers start calling out. I have a North Carolinian, Bob Carlton, who's in there, and now this room becomes totally silent because all we're calling out is seconds of fuel remaining. And we call off 120 seconds. And then there's a 60 seconds, and the crew's still up and away. They're doing their throttling. They're trying to find a landing point. Then we call out 30 seconds, and now I'm in the process of getting my team moving in the direction of counting down to a very risky land abort decision. Because now you're down close to the surface, and there's a dead man's curve down there, and you've got to watch your descent rate versus throttle setting if you want to get away from that guy. And about the time Bob calls out, he starts fifth, and he stops right in mid-voice there, 15 seconds. And then we realize the crew's going through engine shutdown. And we landed that day with less than 17 seconds of fuel remaining. And that's was probably about as close as you'd ever want to get for your first lunar landing. Okay, go ahead.
Sir, talk a little bit about the lessons learned out of Apollo 12, and then if you would go right into
12 was one of the interesting ones. I had a rookie flight director, Jerry Griffin, another fighter pilot, thank God. And about the time we lifted off, we got hit twice by lightning. And lightning knocked every one of the spacecraft systems offline. And the concern is that with the loss of power to the fuel cells, the reactant valves will close and the fuel cells will starve. And so you had a 2-minute window of opportunity to save that mission. And I had a young farm boy from Oklahoma by the name of John Aaron. He was also the guy I leaned on during Apollo 13. And he comes up and he remembered a very obscure switch that would restore it. It was the backup power supply for instrumentation. He calls up the flight and say, flight, have the crew throw the switch, and nobody understood what he was talking about. And basically called again. He called again, voiced it up to the crew on board the spacecraft. The crew didn't know what the hell we wanted them to do, and they were debating on board the spacecraft. Where is the switch? What part of the spacecraft's in right on down the line? Finally, we got that sorted out, brought the instrumentation back online, and then the rest of the control team could go to work. And basically, we verified reactants were flowing, got the fuel cells back online, secured the navigation system, and that 2-minute window pulled that mission out of the fire. So Apollo 11, 12 have been pretty dicey, so now it's time to talk 13.
Sure.
Yeah. Go ahead. Well, 13. Chewie read the book, so we're going to let him do it, okay? 13 was, everybody says, how'd the movie go? And the movie was probably about an A-, a B+, something in that range. And the thing I liked about it was the way they portrayed my controllers, because these people were beautiful. They were truly an elite team to work with. I mean, they were as pumped up and as competent as any group of Americans you'd ever want. The explosion occurred about 55 hours into the mission. And the toughest decision that had to be made, and had to be made immediately, because we're just moving into what we call the lunar sphere of influence. And this is the point of the mission where you cross over from the Earth's gravity to the moon's gravity. And at that point on the mission, for 4 hours, you have 2 mission abort options. One comes around the front side of the moon, the other one goes completely around the moon. But you got to make your mind quick because time and these options are running out. My team was split. My systems guys, after the explosion, we really did not have any idea of the damage. And we got to make this decision.